writer and producer for television, having written Hawaii Five-0, Providence, and Steven Spielberg's Fallen Skies. She served as showrunner for Judging Amy, Jericho, Swingtown, and most recently Touch, starring Kiefer Sutherland. Carol created the CBS medical drama Three Rivers and is currently developing a cable drama series for Amy. So thank you all for being here today. I'd like to move now to Carol Barbee, and maybe ask you from your experience and perspective to talk a little bit about some of the amazing stories you've created and what role research has played in informing your stories. You actually created a whole series for television that dealt with organ transplantation. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about how we use different resources, maybe even Hollywood Health and Society in the process.
Yes, I'm primarily a television writer in the United States, and as such, we usually do 22 episodes a year, which is quite a lot actually. So we're always looking for stories, and we can't possibly just tell our own stories constantly because we run out of them. So I'm a huge fan of research and a huge fan of going to the truth and letting the story find me. And so I was under contract to one of our networks, CBS, and they asked me to come up with a medical show. As you probably know, medical shows, law shows, crime shows, those are the sort of staple of American television because the story walks in the door every week and you have a franchise to tell a story. So I wanted to do a medical drama that was not overexposed, a subject matter that was not overexposed on television, and I decided to do something about organ transplants. And I didn't know anything about organ transplants, and so I convinced CBS to send me to one of the top hospitals in the country who did organ transplants. And I spent weeks with a team of surgeons and their nurses and their anesthesiologists, and I just observed them. I didn't have a story to tell. I wanted to find out what the story was, and it was amazing what I saw. And so from that, I was able to create the show Three Rivers, and those stories came absolutely from real life, from stories we were told by donors and doctors and recipients. Along the way, I've always used whatever resources I could to get the story right, because when you're doing a story about medical issues or mental health issues, or even on Falling Skies, which is a sci-fi show, we are given very specific directions to make sure everything is based in science. And so I'm a big fan of research. So along the way, I've used Hollywood Health and Society many times in my career. I did a storyline on Judging Amy many years ago about a girl with anorexia, and called Hollywood Health and Society, and they hooked me up with a specialist. And that storyline won a couple of awards, and it was just true to what was going on at that moment in time. So we weren't just making it up. I certainly use them for Three Rivers, and so anyway, I'm a big fan of going to the truth and being able to then have the story come out of that. I was very lucky a couple of years ago to go with Hollywood Health and Society on a trip to South Africa, and was told several stories there. Just again, I wasn't looking for any story in particular, but several of them found me, and we were able to use them in some of the shows that I've done. And one other thing I would say is that my other job as a television writer, I'm also what we call a showrunner, which means that I run the show. And so I'll have a staff of writers who work with me, and all of them will be writing scripts. All their scripts will be in process in different various forms of production or process, and I have to keep an eye on all of them. And when you're doing a show, like a medical show, that you want to make sure you're putting out good information, you don't want to make it up. I made sure that my writers had the number of Hollywood Health and Society, and whenever I would get a script in and I would see a medical issue, I'd say, make sure you check this with them. And we would also have other medical advisors as well, but I knew that Hollywood Health and Society would hook us up with specialists who could make sure that we were getting it right.
we have a chance to hear first from Carol Barbee, who will be talking about, from her perspective as a television showrunner, producer, and writer, how she has used research, whether it's with Hollywood Health and Society or overseas travel or other means, to ground her stories in the truth. And she's going to talk about some of the nuts and bolts.
Since I'm here representing television from the United States, I'll just say that in our system in television, writers run television. And that's because the story is king. The story is the thing that has to continue week after week after week. And therefore, the writer has to be there to figure out what that story is, to write those scripts. As opposed to a film where the script can be done way ahead of time and it's one story, and it can and then it's handed off, and the people who are making the film are the ones who are running that production. But in television in the United States, writers run television. Typically, I'm also a showrunner, meaning I run the show. So typically I'll have a staff of anywhere between 6 and maybe 8 writers working with me, of all different levels of experience. What you try to do when you put together a writer's room, a friend of mine once said, it's less about finding the 8 best writers in town, and it's more about putting together a really great dinner party, because you need people to have different strengths. You don't need all one thing. You need somebody who's good at procedure. You need somebody who's good at character. You need somebody who's funny. Hopefully everybody has a little bit of everything, but you certainly need different types of writers in your writer's room that you feel will tell your story well. So along the way, what you try to do is get your writers on board with the research that you found important enough to create a show around. So there are many places along the way where research comes into play. One of them is when you're pitching the show, and you're trying to figure out what your show is. As I said before, when I was able to create a medical show called Three Rivers, which I'll show you a clip in just a minute of that. I was working for a network. They asked for a medical show. I came up with an idea, but then I went off and did research to figure out what that show could be. Then I consulted with other experts along the way. When we came up with specific storylines, I would call somebody like Hollywood Health and Society and say, okay, this week we're doing a story about cornea transplants. Who can you hook me up with who understands cornea transplants? Next week we're doing a show about liver transplants. I need to talk to somebody who's a liver specialist or a patient who had a liver transplant. All of those things are important to the story, and a lot of times when the writer starts to talk to the expert, such specific, wonderful details come out that you find a story that you never could have imagined on your own, and the story becomes much more compelling, much more interesting, not something you've seen before. Because it's not something I'm just making up out of thin air. It's something that specifically happened. And truth is actually much more interesting than fiction a lot of the time. So the first clip is from the show Three Rivers. And this was a story that, again, when I was doing my research, one of the stories I was told over and over and over again by different people in different hospitals, different patients, different doctors, excuse me, is that one of the most common things that they hear when there's been a heart transplant is if the donor's family is ever allowed to meet the patient. It's up to both parties to decide if they want to do that. But one of the most common things that they hear is that the donor's family always says, "Can I hear the heartbeat?" Because one of the wonderful things about organ transplants, particularly a heart transplant, is that it's one of the only good things that can come out of a very bad situation for the family who has lost someone. And they can hear, and with a heartbeat, they can hear some part of their loved one living on. And so this is a story I heard over and over again, and I put it in the pilot of Three Rivers, and this is the scene.
More weeks like this, and you get to go home. Come to community Indiana. Give it a chance.
The donor family is here. This is Sam, Kim Mullen's husband, and Nancy, Kim's mother, Dr. Yablonsky, Anton Others.
Thank you for agreeing to see us so soon. Sure. I brought a picture of Kim. She wanted to teach second grade. I asked her, why second grade? She said, because the kids were still sweet and hadn't been twisted by learning fractions. Thank you. Thank you for, you know,
Can I hear my daughter's heartbeat?
yeah.
You have to live for two now.
One of the other things that was going on in that scene was that the mother in this story was actually she was very prejudiced against the guy her daughter had just married because he was Jewish, and she didn't like that. And by the end of the episode, she's got her head on the chest of a black man. She just wants to hear her daughter's heartbeat, and it's a way of doing something about racism without doing a story about racism. You just sort of see her progress throughout the episode. So that was from Three Rivers, and one of the other ways that research has really helped me was that a couple years ago, Sandra invited me to come along with her and Hollywood Health and Society to take a trip to Johannesburg and South Africa to see. The trip was actually specifically focused on the health issue of HIV/AIDS, and it was a fascinating trip, and I learned so much. And again, I didn't go there looking for any particular story, but I found a lot of stories. Well, one of the stories that came out of it was told to us by a group of women, and I happened to be working on a show at the time called Touch, which was a show that starred Kiefer Sutherland, and it was a show about global stories. It was about how we're all connected around the world, and a little bit about the butterfly effect, how what you do in one part of the world really does affect people in another part of the world, and played to a theme that I really like, which is that we're all connected. So even though the trip itself was focused on HIV/AIDS, when I came back, I wrote a story about violence against women, and it just worked into the story of Touch. And so I think we have that clip as well. The woman you see on the screen there, she played Sala. She was actually from Johannesburg, and the woman who played Grace, the other woman, was from Nigeria, and we filmed this in LA. And two things. First of all, the set that was built, the costumes, the look of it, the colors, they all came from photographs that I brought back from our trip to Johannesburg. I just put them up on my computer and showed them to the production designer. And I said, this is Soweto, this is what it should look like. And they made it, and it was kind of amazing. I mean, that's in LA. And then the actresses that we got, a lot of them were from Nigeria and South Africa. And the woman who played Grace was telling me
that was very common where she was from, for women to do this kind of a civil disobedience, because it was the only power they had. Their power was to say, "I see you. We all see you," and that sometimes it was able to stop the violence. So that's what the story was about. And not only was the research helpful to me in getting the story right, but also just the look of it. So anyway, those are examples of how I have used research in my work, and Hollywood Health and Society has been really, really helpful to me, and hopefully they will be to you.